Hey guys, what's up? Today we're going to be looking at drum mica. It's a Kontakt instrument that is totally free and it comes from Sennheiser. This came out a few years ago, maybe 2013. Essentially, it's a way to demo the different microphones that Sennheiser and Neumann make in the context of a drum mix. So they created this Kontakt patch. It will run in the full Kontakt or Kontakt Player. And for example, this is the kick drum. We can switch it to 3 different microphones and hear how that changes the sound. This is also a somewhat useful virtual instrument, and I see it recommended a lot, but I think it takes a bit of effort to actually make it sound good and usable and interesting in a mix. So that's what we're going to do today. I went ahead and created a couple templates. So the first one is just kind of straight out of the plugin with multi-channel outputs for Reaper. And then another one where I've used stock plugins from Reaper and tried to make it as good sounding as possible. But again, just using the stock plugins, which is quite limiting, especially with things like reverbs and saturation plugins, stuff that I would normally use on a drum kit. I'm not able to do with this. So you can take that as a starting point and then build upon that, using your favorite compressors, EQs, saturation plugins, tape saturation, all those kinds of things. So let's go through this plugin. On the first tab, we have the beats, and it comes with a fairly large library of drum beats. So you can build a song just using this if you want it. And in this session, I have a couple of things from the metal package that just as an example so we can hear something. Now on the drums page, we can select any of the microphones and swap them out like that. And next tab is the mixer. And so we have controls for hi-hat, bass drum, a second mic on the bass drum, the snare mic, the snare bottom mic, 3 toms, overheads, and then there's a reverb, which is just built into Kontakt. So we don't have room mics, and we don't have spot mics on the cymbals. If we take the overheads, and you just click on the microphone name there at the top of the fader, you can see the different microphones. And so this one right now is the USM69i. It's a stereo microphone with an XY pattern. You can also have it as 2 pencil condensers, another pair of cardioid condensers, or a pair of MKH 80s, and I guess they're probably on cardioid in an XY pattern. And then on the options page, we can adjust the velocity curve, linear, degressive, or progressive. Just have it on linear. You can change the Midi mapping. So if you already have pre-recorded MIDI drums or pre-programmed MIDI drums, you might want to experiment with these. All the beats that come with this use the GM, but if you're importing something from another song, you might want to try these other things. You might need to manually adjust things. Then there's the routing section where we can choose which output is for each drum. I've gone ahead and set this up. It's such a pain to do in Kontakt. You have to create the outputs, then restart the plugin. Then you can assign the outputs. And then you have to go into Reaper and actually configure all those outputs. And then you'll have to reassign all the numbers, all the channels so that they work right. I believe I've already done this correctly for you guys, so it'll just be a matter of right-clicking on a track, inserting a track template, and you can access the drum mica track templates, and just it'll load up all the tracks with all the settings that I thought was a good starting point. All right, so we're a few minutes into this already, and we haven't heard anything. This is the starting point track template that I'm sharing with you guys. It's basically the default drum kit, mixer settings on default, no effects inside of this plugin. And yeah, so let's hear it. So it's a very, very flat, kind of boring drum recording. There's no special vibe to this. There's absolutely no room in here. They're not inspiring to play along to, unlike things that I've shown in other videos like the Kurt Ballou signature series or the Blasting Room stuff. I hear this and I don't want to pick up my guitar and play, but with these other more premium drum kits, you just want to play along with it instantly. So that aside, there's still a lot of room to work with this. This is kind of like if you're recording in a dead basement, you might have a sound that's similar to this. This is not too far off from the really dry drums that I've had come in for editing or mixing. So it needs work. So let's just listen to that one more time and think about what this actually needs. We can't change out the drums. We can't change the balance of the cymbals, unfortunately. So some of those crashes are quite loud compared to, the toms. This Kontakt instrument doesn't give us that control, which is unfortunate. And I could technically go in here and edit this stuff, but then you wouldn't be able to use the free version of Kontakt along with this. So if you want to use this track template as a starting point, add all your own favorite effects to this, then that's a free virtual drum kit option for you. So I'm going to mute that, and I'll show you my customized version of this. Same starting point. I've gone through and changed some of these microphones. So like the kick drum, I'm using the E901. The the snare, I'm using the 441. All the toms, I'm using the E904s. Besides that, I've EQ'd, compressed, transient shaped things. I've added in a drum reverb and a fake room, which is again just a reverb. Also, the faders are all moved away from the defaults. So let's start off with, we'll just play this with all the effects turned off. So I'm gonna turn off the effects. And same drum beats, let's hear it again. All right, so it's still kind of a flat, boring sort of drum mix, but it's a better mix. It has a little more character, and that's just by changing the microphone settings and moving the faders around a little bit. Next, I went through and did some EQ on these. So let's just do a EQ only version of this. I'll just bypass these other plugins. Try to get all these on the screen at once. There's Tom 3, and the last one is the overheads. So this is what I went with. So that's sounding a little bit better. Let's take this kick drum here. I used a Transient Controller plugin. This is included with Reaper again. And I've just kind of tightened it up a little bit. It's a fairly subtle effect here, but it does help. And the other kick drum sounds like this. If I take off the EQ, it's like this. And again, I'm using the Transient Controller, just tightening it up a little bit, and those two together. That kick rear mic just adds in a little bit more of more thickness to the kick, more punch. So I've got the snare EQ and Transient Controller, followed by a saturation plugin. That's just set at 22, and then a soft clipper. Looks like this, which is actually doing nothing except limiting the peaks to -3 dBFS. So hear the snare top by itself. And without effects. So there's some really kind of gross ringing sounds that I would usually, with a virtual instrument, avoid by just picking a different snare. And in this case, I'm using a couple kind of narrow notches, one around 500 hertz and one around 1K. Yeah, I would normally just change the snare if I hated the ringing sound that much, but this is what I went with. And then here's the snare bottom EQ and blended together. So that snare it adds in a lot of brightness and texture. Next up is the toms. So this high tom, if I take off the EQ, it's got this really long note, just rings out forever, and it sounds horrible to me. So that's what this notch here, band to 125 hertz, and it's just completely cutting that out. Each of these toms use the Transient Controller plugin. I think it's the same settings on all of these. Yeah, so plus 49 and minus 25 on sustain. It reduces the tail end of that tom hit. You can kind of use a gate in this way, but this doesn't actually reduce like background noise or anything like that, which is non-existent in this recording anyways. But we can also use this to kind of amplify just the stick attack of the tom. And then because this Transient Controller plugin adds in a lot of volume, I'm also using the soft clipper on this just in case. And the soft clipper can give kind of a more aggressive edge along with just, locking in that volume. So here we go. And with those effects off, sounds like this. Kind of just inflates them, makes them sound a little more real, closer to what I would want if I was recording those drums myself. Hi-hat. I didn't do any EQ on this. A lot of the hi-hat comes from the overheads. So let's just listen to the overheads with, I guess, without the EQ. So I wanted something that kind of like smashes down the snare and those toms. It just kind of keeps everything under control. I'm using a 6:1 ratio, a large knee size, stuff that's below the threshold. It's still going to do some compression. Slow attack because I want the sustain of the snare to be compressed, but not so much like the stick attack, the crack of it. Yeah, nothing too special about this compression setting. It kind of just beefs up everything. So that's what I'm liking about that setting. These next two tracks, these are just the auxiliary tracks from Kontakt. And I just left them there in case I want to use some of the effects that are inside of Kontakt. So then we come to the drum reverb, and I'll just solo this so you can see what it's like. Let me close these other windows. So we have Reaper's Reverbate plugin, which it's not a great reverb, but you can get something usable about half the time. So room size 75, 100% dampening, stereo width at half. So I wanted this reverb to be less wide than my imaginary drum rooms. So this adds width to that mono snare, and then the fake room blended in with it makes it sound even wider. I didn't want two reverbs that were 100% wide. I decided to do no pre-delay on this, and I'm not filtering this at all inside the plugin because these filters are kind of steep. I didn't like that. The filters in Re-EQ sound a little bit better to me. So I've got the low shelf is really doing a high pass, and let's see, 185.5 hertz. Band 3, this is at 730, and I think this is just to kind of suppress some of that like weird ringing sounds that are from the drums and also from this reverb, sort of this weird metallic sound. And then I'm just doing kind of a gentle roll off with the high shelf, 8.6K minus 9. So yeah, taking off quite a bit of the highs, but it makes it sound a lot smoother. All right, so this is reverb soloed with no EQ on it. So here's the reverb with an EQ after it. And I almost always EQ my reverbs in solo, and just to get rid of anything that's kind of just doesn't sound good, you know? And then I just make sure that it works in context. It's fairly easy to go too far with it, but I find it always helps to have at least a little bit of EQ after the reverb. Going into this track, let's see. There's the snare, top and bottom. There's the 3 toms and the overheads. So yeah, so let's hear that drum reverb track in the mix. Okay, and one more with it started muted, and then we'll bring it in after a couple bars. So it makes a big difference. It sounds a lot more real. Even having this crappy sounding reverb in there, it makes it sound more like a real drum kit. So then we come to the fake room track. I did a video on how to fake a drum room. I think this is a different way than I did there. This is kind of just my first attempt at doing this. Went with a reverb that has more texture and more vibe than that other reverb that we had. So EQ, what am I doing here at band 2? 420 at minus 8. So just really notching down that boxy area. Reverbate, actually a little bit shorter of a room size, but I'm using no dampening. And stereo width a little bit wider than the last one. Delaying the wet signal by 8 milliseconds. And I am filtering here because I want it to be I just found that it sounded more like a real room once I used these filters. Then I'm using some or a lot of compression on this. Feeding into this track, I've got the kick rear, the snare bottom, the 3 toms, the hi-hat, and the overheads. My reasoning for doing that, sending these in there, is because that's kind of the stuff that's going to be into a room mic when it's a real mic in the room. I decided to do pre-effects sends because in real life, we wouldn't have the sound of the mics influencing the sound of the room mics, but that's what we have to work with. But you definitely wouldn't have EQ, compression, things like that going into the sound that the microphone picks up. So I went with a pre-effects send. For the toms and the hi-hat, I also panned them to be, to be the same as the source signals, and that helped add more width to this recording. All right, so let's hear that fake room by itself. So that doesn't sound like a real drum room, but it is an improvement. Here's just the reverb by itself. Adding EQ. I always compress room mics, so I'm compressing this fake room, and it fills the role that it needs to, I think, but it's definitely not as good as a real drum room. All right, I've said that a million times, but let's just hear all these drums together now. So that's better. Now, I've decided to work on the drum master track. So first up is the saturation plugin. It's at 67%, and it's adding a lot of volume, but it is kind of changing the characteristic of those drums. Then there is the Event Horizon Limiter Clipper. So I've got the threshold set at -1, which gives a 1 decibel boost to everything coming after, but I'm also limiting the ceiling to -1.5. Then I've got another EQ, again, kind of filtering in the same area. So I'm giving a little bump to the kick drum at 167. At band 3, I've got 650 hertz at -3. Band 4 is the high shelf, and that's at 5.4K, boosting 2.5 dB, quite a bit actually. And band 5 is 1800 hertz, about 2 dB. So that's just kind of adding in a little more clarity to the snare and things like that. Then I've got some compression. Let's see how much compression is actually happening here. So the balance of those reverbs really needs to change once you bring in the mix bus compression. Yeah, so we're doing quite a bit of compression here. 4:1, 6 dB knee, sort of a slow attack, faster release than some of the other settings that I used. Threshold's at -14, which is fairly high, I guess, compared to some of the other ones. Like on the overhead, it's at -20. And overhead's very slow release. So this is just kind of adding in vibe. It's really smashing down on the snare and the toms and the kick, but still letting in a little bit of that attack through. This order of operations isn't exactly the same as what I did. I kind of focused on each one. I think I did the snare first, and then I went on to the kick. Then I think I did the overheads. I focused on the toms. I just did the EQ first. And then I went back to the snare. I put on the saturation and the clipping, and I decided to do the clipper on the toms as well. Then I did the reverb and then the fake room. And all throughout this, I was choosing different mics in Kontakt just to find the best balance, the best sound. So here's how it sounds with everything together. And I think this is a better sound. It's more interesting. There's some character to it. It doesn't sound like a totally dead, dry room. Maybe a more inspiring starting point for creating songs. So here we go, one more time. So there you go. These templates will be available. There'll be a link in the description, and at some point I will be adding these into my download bundle for patrons and for my newsletter subscribers. So they will all be in one place as well. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Drum mica it's an interesting Kontakt instrument. It's not as good as it could be. There are little things like no control over the cymbals. The panning of the toms isn't in the overheads signal, which is kind of a pain. But I mean, it's free and it's usable. And I think with these templates that I'm sharing, you'll be in a better place than without them. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. You can join our Facebook group, Reaper Blog Community. Support the Reaper Blog on Patreon, and visit reaperblog.net for a lot more tutorials.